My name's John Shoup, and I get to be the Dean of the School of Education. And this is actually the second seminar in our Leadership Seminar series. And again, I want to say thank you for coming, braving the heat and everything. What I would like to do is typical for our events. Let me open in prayer, and then we'll dive right into it. Father, we unite our hearts asking for your blessings. I ask that this would be a wonderful time, a time of learning, a time of engagement, a time of thinking on high things. Pray you'll bless each one here and in their individual pursuits and reward their time accordingly. Thank you that we can gather and think on these things. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Again, thanks for coming. We had 273 people sign up for this event, so about half are going to come face to face, and then the other half are online. So hopefully our technology will work. What we want to do is talk about leadership quotient, improving leadership perspectives and practices. And as a school of education, we offer a couple masters, one in leadership and org study, one in leadership and adult learning. So this is just a vignette or one portion of one of those classes that we cover in the program. So we thought it'd be fun just to offer it and hopefully encourage you as you think about leadership. Now, as it said on the web and as it said on the radio, here's the goal. Here's what hopefully we will walk away tonight. That is enhancing our understanding of leadership, develop essential perspective skills so that we can actually practice exemplary leadership. Now, there's a mass of literature out there. What is leadership? How do we understand leadership? And it comes from both from the popular press and from the academic press. So this is really kind of a synthesis of that from the academic side of the equation, how to understand leadership and therefore how to better practice leadership. So that's the goal. I shared this slide at the last seminar, but the premise or the assumption is if all we have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when it comes to leadership, it's very challenging and complex, and we don't want to treat everyone or every situation as if it were a nail. So one of the goals of this seminar is to increase or expand our tool belt and have additional tools to bring about change or to be an effective leader. I commend you for taking time to come out because JFK, this was going to be his speech prior to his assassination. And he was going to talk about leadership and education. And he actually says leadership and education go hand in hand. If you want to improve your leadership abilities, education is important. And education is also predicated on good leadership, so the two are indistinguishable, so they go hand in hand. So that's one of the reasons we do these type of seminars. Okay, why is this important? Well, for some, I'm going to suggest it's leadership ability that gets people promoted. If you actually look at what gets people promoted, when you get hired in an organization, usually your first job is at entry level, and you have to have the minimal competencies. But look at what causes people to advance in the hierarchy. And again, you'll see that, okay, the first level is everyone has to have basic competency. So that's, again, the entry level. But after you establish your competency, this is what's going to get you promoted. You're able to get results. You have a strong work ethic. You're a team player. Ability to work with others. Cultivate trust. And then deal with ambiguity. Why is that slow there? So the ability to deal with ambiguity. These are all what are called soft leadership skills. And so again, this seminar is hopefully giving us a foundation or planting the seed what it takes to develop some soft leadership skills. Okay, before we dive into it, though, I'm going to ask you a few questions. And I'm going to give you just a few minutes to think. If this were a full-blown class and we had a couple hours, it'd be fun to actually spend 20 minutes on each question. Because of time, we're only going to spend about a minute on each question. But I want you to think for a minute, what makes a leader versus a follower? How do you define leader or leadership? So take a minute just to think. And I might ask some of you. Oh, and for those, while you're thinking, for those who are participating online, and well, actually anyone, feel free to ask questions along the way. And for those participating online, there's a chat box, you can type a question in the instant message box. But please note that when you type your question in the instant message box, everyone gets to see it. So you want to be judicious if you want to say anything bad about me in the instant message box. But again, feel free to ask questions along the way. Anybody want to just throw out one definition of leadership? Anyone want? Yes?
They're able to inspire others to become more, to be more.
Okay, so there's something that they do to inspire others. Do you have any idea what that is? what they do to inspire people. Okay, yes?
Well, they motivate people.
Okay, they motivate people, so it's influence and inspire, so there's a motivational aspect. Again, what do they do to motivate? We'll hang on to that. Okay, given your definition of leadership, would you consider, would you consider Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Hussein leaders then, given your definition of leaders?
Yeah.
Okay. Wow, anyone disagree with that? Okay, just for fun, some would say there's a difference between yielding leadership and yielding power. Being a tyrant does not give you leadership. Maybe it does. Again, we can debate this. But I'm going to suggest that there's something we like about leadership when we talk about leadership that we don't necessarily like to associate with Stalin and Mao, Hitler. There's certain things about leadership that we think is qualitatively different. But for many, we say, yeah, they were good leaders. Some would argue they just yielded power, though. So we're going to play with that, just to get us a baseline and a definition. Because if we recognize Hitler and Mao, they carried a lot of influence and they motivated people, well, then we just legitimize that as a practice for leadership or a style of leadership. And one of the goals of this is to say our assumptions of how we understand leadership is how we're going to operationalize it. It's how we will live it out. So we really want to have an evaluated understanding of leadership. Okay, is leadership different than management? If so, how? Again, I'll give you just a minute to think. Because we talk about managers, we talk about leaders. Are they the same, or are they different? So I'll give you, again, a minute to think. Okay, we already had someone raise their hand. Sir, you're on.
Well, I think leadership, people will follow you because they want to, not because they have to. Management, you're like a boss. People have to listen to you no matter what.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so there's one difference that you kind of have managers, you have to comply to a manager regardless. Leaders, you don't necessarily have to comply with.
but you follow them because you want to, not because you have to.
Okay. Yes.
Leader is more of influencing people, management is task oriented.
Okay, so managers focus a little more on task and compliance, and leaders build relationships. And yes, in the back.
Well, management can be many different things, not just people. You can manage time, you can manage resources. So as a consequence, you're taking a look at what you have available to you, and are these going to match what the outcome needs to be, and what do I need to get there in the meantime? Leadership, on the other hand, is a motivator. You provide motivation to the people that follow you, and then under those contexts, people say, oh yes, I see your vision, I see what the future is going to be, I'll be glad to help you get there.
Okay, and that's a nice distinction. We're going to actually come back to that. But let me ask you this then, and not just you, but if you want to answer it. But do we want organizations that only have leaders, or do we need managers? We need both. And so we'll come back to that, but that's an important distinction. But at the same time, can a manager not be a leader? And a leader needs to be a manager. So we're going to play with that. But if our understanding of leadership is just management, I've never met anyone who wants to be managed. We'd rather be led. So our understanding and our model for leadership really makes a big difference in the terms of how we relate to people, the work environment, the culture we create. Okay, good. Wonderful. Now, here's another question. This one, you can just think, are leaders made or born? 1 minute to think. Oh, we got some eager peepers. Some are saying both, okay? How many, the story out there is you can recognize those born leaders. And you recognize them in kindergarten and on the playground right away. So some think that leaders are born. Others say leaders are made. No, it's environment, nurturing, things like that. Leadership can be learned. And then we have some saying both. Any purists in the room? Those who say strictly born. You're either born with it or not. Okay. Any purists on the other side? No, it's definitely nurtured then. We got one who can be nurtured. Okay. All right, well, we're going to come back to that in a minute. So, again, we're establishing a baseline. Now, just, again, take a minute, and we're going to come back to this. but think of your metaphor for leadership. Metaphors are word pictures, right? So if you have a good metaphor, it will reveal our assumptions again about leadership, and it will speak 1,000 words. The picture's worth 10,000 words. So if you have a metaphor, a good word picture, you've actually captured leadership in 10,000 words or less. Good word picture. So think about what might be your metaphor for leadership. Leadership is juggling. Leadership is being a quarterback or things like that. So again, I'll just give you a few seconds to think. Because depending on how robust our metaphor for leadership is, will depend how we can operationalize it or act it out. Okay, who's your ideal leader and why? Anyone have an ideal leader? Someone that they go, that is a leader, and they recognize that person. Anyone want to volunteer? Yes?
Flexible, yeah, very flexible.
So a person who's very flexible is an ideal leader. But then I'm also thinking of anybody who knows a person that they identify with that might be their ideal leader and why. Yes? Your pastor? And what is it about your pastor that makes him an ideal leader?
Well, I know him since I was 10, and I know how he is. He is very, very honest. He shows that he, even at his age right now, he's just got a diploma from UCR. He's still, getting involved in the community. He's good with his family. There's a lot of things.
Okay, so it's multifaceted. She was saying her pastor, honesty, sounds like a lifelong learner, very involved, engaged. So it's a very multifaceted. It'll be rare that we'll hone in on one attribute because, again, leadership is so complex. Here's the more relevant question, and you don't have to answer it. But as we look at exemplary leadership, and we're going to distinguish leadership and exemplary leadership, because again, if Hitler can be considered a good leader, what makes exemplary leadership? And so again, hopefully we'll walk away saying, I know what it takes to be an exemplary leader. And I can cultivate those things. So hopefully by the end of this fast hour, we will answer all those questions in a way that you can walk away and go home and say, here's what I learned. Okay, the interesting thing is we all have a theory of leadership. We can't escape it. We all have what's called an implicit theory of leadership. It's called implicit leadership theory. And it's this implicit leadership theory that we go and evaluate leadership. We evaluate our immediate supervisors, we evaluate supervisors around us, we evaluate world leaders and say, oh, based upon my implicit understanding, that's either good or bad. And so the fortunate thing or unfortunate thing, some implicit theories are better than others. So hopefully by the end of this time, again, we'll have a little more foundation for our implicit theory. What guides our implicit theory? What actually makes for good leadership versus what I just have learned as I've gone through life. And I suggest there's a lot there to be learned to understand what makes for good leaders. Okay, there's two premises. There's two things guiding this whole seminar. The first is informal and formal leadership matters. The nice thing is you don't need to have a formal title to be a significant leader. Informal leaders actually can make a greater difference in the organization, sometimes greater than the formal leader. So whatever level we're at, or whatever level we're inspiring, informal and formal leadership matters. And if you really want to doubt if informal leaders have significance, well, there's Rosa Parks as an informal leader. And there's plenty of stories of informal leaders who can make a difference, and you'll see some citations. I should also say, if you want this PowerPoint, all you have to do is email me. I can send it to you. So you don't have to take detailed notes. You can enjoy the listening, however you learn, but I will make it available. And premise two, I'm giving away the answer to one of the questions, but the premise is leadership can be learned. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't be here. So when the question comes, are leaders made and born? Well, obviously all leaders I know have been born, so that's redundant. But yes, leaders are born and made. Gardner says most of what people know about leadership can be learned. This is important. I'm going to read this slide. I'm going to read a couple, so indulge me. Leadership and wisdom are both made, even if both are built on the genetic abilities people are endowed with at birth, like cognitive abilities. Leadership and wisdom can be cultivated. There's a whole research genre that we can learn wisdom. I mean, if you read the book of Proverbs is shouting out the street. Wisdom's shouting out the street. It's available to us all. So it can be learned, it can be developed. So can leadership. Avilo looked at studies of identical twins and concluded that, okay, there has to be at least some genetic baseline. I mean, there is a genetic baseline. And he says genetics only account for 30%. 70% counts for the rest. So the good news is leadership can be learned. Now, again, I'm going to move a little fast through this. Why is studying leadership important? First of all, there's a crisis in leadership. First of all, there's low confidence. Since 2005, the confidence in our leaders has gone below average. So we don't have very much confidence in our leaders. Confidence is at its lowest index since 1985. So leadership crisis, there's first of all low confidence. And this comes from the Kennedy, the Center for Public Leadership. We have a leadership crisis in the country today. 77% say yes. That's a pretty unhealthy perception of leaders. Unless we get better leaders, the United States will decline as a nation. 77% say yes, we need better leaders. And then overall, our country leaders are effective, and 76% disagree. So there's a perception that there's a crisis in leadership. Not only is there a crisis, there's a shortage. There's documented shortages that almost every sector, they're having a hard time finding leaders, qualified leaders. They're not having a hard time finding more bodies, but finding qualified, capable leaders. And then Bennett says true leaders are an endangered species, true leaders. So not only is there a confidence perception issue, there's a shortage issue, and then there's just bad leaders out there. There are bad leaders out there. Kellerman doctored in bad leadership. She also did a book, and I wanted to put this here, is that she talks about how, another book, how followers are creating change and changing leaders. Again, want to move away from the concept of leadership development as those only reserved for those who hold the title. That informal leaders actually carry a lot of weight, can create change and can do more. So even if you're stuck with a lousy formal leader above us, that doesn't mean we're destined to have that experience. And there are things followers can do to make change. So, anyway, there's a lot of bad leaders. Now again, I'm going to read a few things just because they document how prevalent it is. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands if this is your experience, but we know full well, even based on our experience, that bad leaders are ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere. They populate every sector. Less than half of leaders instill trust in their subordinates. About 40%, 2 out of 5 bosses actually lack leadership skills. And 1 in 7 superiors are considered by their subordinates to be role models. So we don't have very many role models for leaders, unfortunately, even in the workplace. Not only that, 40% of the 700 workers surveyed said their subordinates failed to keep promises. More than a third complained their bosses did not give credit where credit was due. And just under 1/3 reported that in the last year they were subjected to the superior silent treatment. Now, again, no show of hands, but it is prevalent. So low confidence, shortage, and then bad leaders. Another study found something similar. 2/3 of existing managers are insufferable, and at least half will eventually be fired. 75% of working adults report the most stressful aspect of their job is their immediate boss. Doesn't paint a pretty picture for anyone who wants to gravitate towards formal leadership. So not only is there a shortage, crisis, perception, there's a low appeal. People are not gravitating at least to formal leadership positions for a variety of reasons. One is perceived as presumptuous. Well, I don't know that I have leadership material, or I don't know that I'm capable of leadership, so we shy away from it. The myth of leadership, meaning, oh, you have to, everyone's implicit theory of leadership suggests that you have to have all these characteristics and traits to be good, and that list can actually get overwhelming. Many people don't exercise leadership because they say they lack a formal title, and yet we don't need a formal title to exercise leadership, which hopefully will come out. And then those who are in formal leadership positions, there's a lot of headaches and heartaches. It's a challenging job. You can't please everyone, and we'll just hint at that. But so that sort of creates a leadership crisis. Gardner raises an interesting question. Again, he wrote a book on leadership, and he says, the men who founded this nation saw far into the future, but there's one thing they did not see. It never really crossed their minds that the day might come when our best people would avoid leadership roles, particularly roles for public leadership. And so Gardner's lamenting that there aren't people gravitating towards leadership positions, whether it be formal or informal. So when he goes out, he goes, where are the Jeffersons and the Lincolns? Where do we get these modern day leaders? They're out there. And he says, we just have to awaken them. So how do we send a call out to awaken leaders? Basically, that's what Gardner's asking. And hopefully a seminar like this can help plant the seed to say, wow, we can be people of influence regardless of whether we're formal or informal leaders. Okay, let's start answering questions. We already answered this question. Gardner would say, again, leadership is learned. The interesting thing about leaders, and if you look at those leaders who have risen to the top, there's actually a high percentage who had average childhood experiences. That we have this myth that these leaders are born and they're extroverted, they're outgoing, they're assertive. And there's actually research saying actually a lot of leaders are quite the contrary. They've had experiences that were honed them to be effective leaders as they grew up. They didn't have these shining, rising star athletes, 4.0 students. They actually had quite average childhoods. So again, to suggest that leadership is learned and cultivated. When it comes to whether leaders are made or born, here's what Shakespeare said. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. So everyone who said it's both born and nurtured, well, you agree with Shakespeare. Abigail Smith lamented and said, great necessity cries forth great leaders or calls forth great leaders. So sometimes the situation, we rise up to be leaders just because of the situation. I put that quote there from Edmund Burke because when we look at leadership, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. So we need to awaken the leadership in everyone, unless evil triumph. Okay, so let's get to the heart of the matter. Again, I'm going to go a little fast. What is leadership? Well, leadership has been studied widely in the academic press. And as it says here, there's been much written about leadership. If you Googled, and I did this the other day, I Googled leadership. Look at how many hits came up, 73 million. I thought I'd tell you about each one. If you take leadership though, oops. If you take the word leadership and track its frequency of use relative to other words in Google books, you can see that it's spiked. And since 1920, we've been talking more and more about leadership, and it's spiked in terms of relative use. So it's very popular in this day and age to be talking about leadership. Some would say because, again, this leadership crisis. The Bible of Leadership Studies, called the Vast Handbook of Leadership, has over 7,500 references. So it's a thick book, has 7,500 references. Here's what the editor said. There are as many definitions as leadership as there are people who have attempted to define it. So a minute ago, I asked you to define leadership. And if you had a hard time, well, you're in good company. It's very value-laden. Leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on the earth. So when we talk about what is leadership, sorry, we're only going to scratch the surface in an hour. But we'll get close. The nice thing about leadership, though, even though it's hard to define, we recognize it when we see it. It's easy to recognize when we see it. Oh, that's good leadership. But it's somewhat hard to define. But we're going to get close to coming up with a definition. Now, contrary to Burns, who said leadership is hard to understand, we have Kouzes and Posner, who says, no, leadership is very understandable, and it's a universal process. You can recognize good leadership in a business, in a government agency, in an educational setting. It's easily understandable, and it's very universal. Now, I also plant the seed, if you ever wanted to read just one book on leadership, this would be one on the top list, The Leadership Challenge, because it actually synthesizes plenty of research on leadership, and it interviewed managers and employees, and it came up with 5 steps to be a really good leader. If you follow those 5 steps, you'll be a good leader. Now, all that's emerged in the other fields of leadership, so we're going to touch on it, but that's one good book if you want a crash course on leadership. Okay, so what is leadership? I'm going to talk in phases. When people start to study leadership, the very first phase of leadership studies was called the Great Man Theory, or Great Trait Theory. How did you describe a leader? Well, you describe them by their traits. This started as early out as Homer, and we described Odysseus. In the Homer epic, Odysseus is the great leader, and there are certain characteristics and traits that Odysseus brings to the table. that makes him a great leader. Plato talks about the philosopher king. The king needs to be a philosopher, and the philosopher needs to be the king. And you need to be wise and virtuous. That's Plato's version of a leader. So again, we're looking at these traits or these characteristics of good leadership. The neat thing about Plato, though, is he said this happens through education. I mean, you're endowed with certain things, but it's through education that the philosopher emerges. So again, these traits started to emerge on the list. Plutarch wrote a book called Parallel Lives. He was a Greek citizen, a Greek who became a Roman citizen. And what he did is he wanted to compare lives of Greeks and Romans to kind of legitimize to the Greeks that our Romans are just as noble as us Greeks. So we had ethnic wars going on as early as that. But so he did parallel lives. He looked at a Greek statesman and compared him to a Roman statesman. But it's an essay of lives of people, and he celebrates certain characteristics, certain traits that these people had. And so these parallel lives reinforce this mentality or this mindset that if you want to be a good leader, you had to have certain traits. Thomas Carlyle, philosopher, historian, wrote several pamphlets and gave some lectures titled Lectures on Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Heroic History. And he makes a statement: the history of the world is the history of great men. So we're now understanding at this time period, we think leadership of those only happens if you're a great person. If you're born great, if you have certain attributes, you're destined to be a leader. Which is reinforced by Galton, who was a cousin of Darwin, by the way. And he was into the eugenics movement and all that. But he made the statement that if you were born with certain qualities, you were destined for greatness. If you were born with these certain qualities, you could not but help be great. So this is the trait theory that says if you want to be a leader, you have to have these essential traits. Some you're born with, some that maybe can be cultivated. Well, there's a problem with trait theory, though. As they did more and more research, they said the list kept growing and growing, and it became such an endless list. And it resulted in the fact that our leaders, we have these unrealistic expectations for leaders. And this is connected to our implicit sources of leadership. Most of our implicit theories of leadership, whether we recognize it or not, are actually tied to traits. And we often expect our leaders to be Superman and to walk on water, because the traits are endless, and that's what they discovered. And then the interesting thing is that they discovered is that, you know what, a military leader is probably going to have different traits than probably a school leader. I mean, you want certain features in a military leader that you don't necessarily want in a kindergarten teacher, unless you want your kindergarten run like a platoon. Drill sergeant, maybe you do. But, so we say maybe traits vary. Trait theory gave us something valuable, but it fell short. Oh, by the way, if we look at our implicit leadership theory, and if we say it's heavily loaded with traits, we might want to be gracious to our leaders and recognize there's no perfect leader. And yet often in our implicit theory, we think there could be or should be. So, what are certain traits that emerge? Again, the list grew long, but some people came up with a list and kind of condensed it. If you look at the list, again, most of those things can be learned. Most of those things can be cultivated. Again, I don't have the PowerPoint, but if you look at it, you'll see that, again, those can be learned. Now, Northhouse said, he looked at all the traits that were out there and all this long list, and he can put it down to 5 traits. He said they fell into 5 areas. Intelligence. Now, I'm going to suggest to you again, intelligence can be learned. It's not a static concept. We used to think you were born with a certain level of intelligence and you wouldn't go higher. Actually, that's a myth. Intelligence has been rising over the decades, and then intelligence can be developed. But self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. You do have to be sociable to be a leader. I mean, you do have to interact with people, so sociability makes sense. But again, all these things can be learned. Stroud, Vinks, and Kaufman talk about presentation of self, and their biggest thing is you have to be likable. If you want to be a leader, you have to be likable. So, again, because there's this human relations aspect. Now, for those who, I'm going to just give a couple of counter examples. They say a really good educator confuses you, because on the other side of confusion is clarity. So if I confuse you, That's it. I'm going to give a counter example. Moses. When Moses was called to be a leader, if you know the story, he didn't want to volunteer for the job. He said, God, choose someone else. He also said, I'm not very good at speaking, so choose someone else. And then if you look at the Apostle Paul, there's a couple references in the Bible where Paul said, you guys say I'm unimpressive to look at. I mean, how would you like that as your reputation? It's not very good to look at. And his speech is contemptible, not meaning he didn't speak very well. Oh, he can write great letters, but he cannot speak well. He's not very fun to look at. So while these traits are important, there's counter examples too. So I provide that for fun. And if you look at the parable of the talents, as we're faithful with the talents that we've been given, who knows what opportunities God will allow. So, the last thing on traits. This is going back to Kouzes and Posner, and what they did, they interviewed like over 20,000 people. And they developed a list and said, what is it that you look to or look for in your leader? They did it in 1987, and in 1995. They came up with the same top 4. When you go and talk to people and say, who are your exemplary leaders? The top 4 things emerge twice. They're honest people, they're forward-looking, they're inspiring, and they're competent. And Schemers did a similar study, and they found inspiring, gold, trustworthy. So it's really interesting that integrity and honesty emerge at the top of the list. And I tell people in leadership, if your boss ever tells you or asks you to hedge your ethics, hedge the report, you can tell them and say, gosh, that sounds good for short term, but the research says long term, that will sabotage our credibility. So you can now cite research if ever tempted by your boss to hedge ethics. But we know that honesty and integrity are an important feature. Okay, that was a crash course on trait theory. So what's the walkaway? Develop character and essential traits. If you want to be an exemplary leader, again, whether formal and informal, develop some essential traits in character. That's a non-negotiable. Can you generate every trait? No, I've, again, never met a perfect person. But we can generate some essential ones. And you know what those could be in that regard. Okay, in the leadership genre, again, I know I'm going fast, but I want to save some time for questions. But again, I'm giving you the whole survey of literature here. 1948 was a milestone when it came to understanding leadership. As I said that, when people were studying leadership, they go, this list is getting too long. I mean, almost everything's on that list. Sense of humor, wit, hard work. I mean, the list just kept growing and growing. Well, then they realized that maybe it's more than traits. And when they started to look at leadership styles, so a person by the name of Stogdill looked at 124 studies, and this is what he concluded. The qualities, characteristics, and skills required in a leader are determined to a large extent by the situation. So it's not having these great men. It's learning what the situation needs. So how many of you have followed the news, and this is kind of dated news, but Colorado, when they hired a superintendent of instruction, you know who they went to? An admiral from the Navy. Well, obviously he's a good leader. Not necessarily in educational settings. Situations matter. So in leadership, just because I might have a certain traits doesn't necessarily generalize to the context in which we're called to lead. So we start to look at the situation, and some interesting things emerge. 2 studies, different studies from Ohio State and University of Michigan came together. And they say some people are task-oriented and some people are more people-oriented. Now, just for the fun of it, how many of you would prefer to work on a task and not be interrupted? You have a couple, okay. And then probably the rest, no, it's about the people. I'd rather hang out with the people. And that's what they, well, maybe people prefer tasks and some people prefer relationships. Well, then they recognize, well, actually you have to balance both in the equation somehow. So maybe task goes on one continuum and people on the other side. So while we all might have a preference to work on tasks or with people, I've never met anyone who can solely work on tasks without people or work with people without a task. So the two combined, and the situation determines what kind of leadership is needed. So a couple studies, a couple frameworks emerged. So this is called the manager grill. They actually changed the name to the leadership grill because nobody wants to be managed. So later they changed it to the leadership grid. So if you have high concern for results and high concern for people, your leadership style is going to be more of a team manager. You're going to work with the team, you're going to build a team, you're going to keep the team focused. If you have low concern for results and low concern for people, they call that impoverished management. So people would say, find where you are on the grid, and that's the type of leader you'll be. So if you have high concern for results and low concern for people, you might like environments that are a little more authoritative. Top-down leadership, top-down management. Well, then someone came along by the name of Hershey, two people, Hershey and Blanchard, came along and said, well, wait a minute. The environment is not that static. If you really want to be a good leader, you actually have to adjust your leadership style. You can't just be one person all the time, because again, the world's too complex, it's not that clean. So what they said is that your leadership style will actually change over depending upon the people you're working with.